I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know whether any of this is actually a good idea. Today's beer is a classic IPA. It is the Sierra Nevada Pale. I wanted to do a themed beer for today's build as we're going with kind of a green and silver build, so I thought about doing something with like a Jose Silver and Lime, but I hate tequila. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. As I alluded to in the intro, this is probably not going to end up as a recommended build guide. That's not to say there's not some value in the parts I have picked out over here, but the configuration is a little bit odd. Starting with the RX 470Ds that I picked up on Taobao last week for $110. It's not that at $55 these are not a fantastic value for the individual cards, but running in a CROSSFIRE always introduces some compromises into a gaming build, and it's typically not one that I would recommend doing. I would always recommend buying a larger single card for the $110 you would spend, rather than doubling up a pair of lower end cards. That is especially considering the used market as of late, as I've seen RX 588 gig and GTX 1066 gig cards going for about that $110 to $120 price point on eBay and other used sites. If the games you're playing can take full advantage of CROSSFIRE, then these two cards are going to blow the 580 and 1060 out of the water. However, as the pendulum swings the other way, you could see no utilization of the second card, or at worst, even lower performance with CROSSFIRE enabled. Now onto the rest of the parts for today's build, and the really cool thing about this build is not a single component on this table cost me more than $90. In fact, the most expensive part was actually the motherboard, and it is the cheapest knockoff X79 I have found to date. Now, I was a little bit late to the party getting my hands on this motherboard. In fact, Phil's Computer Lab has already posted a pretty thorough walkthrough and review of this board, and if you'd like to see that video, go ahead and click the link down in the video description, and give his channel some love, it is well worth your watch time. What I will say on the surface is at $90, this is one of the cheapest Chinese X79 boards I have come across yet, and by far the most full-featured. It has quad-channel memory, the top two slots are actually full bandwidth X16 PCIe 3 slots. It also has two 1X slots, and the bottom slot is an X4 electrically. It also has NVMe Gen 3 and a standard layout, which means cable management should actually work in most cases. Now, overclocking on these boards has always been a little bit hit or miss, usually leaning towards the latter. However, this time around, I figured I would try out my luck, and I picked up an unlocked Xeon processor. I bet those are two words you never expected to hear together. That down there is an Ivy Bridge-based Intel Xeon E5-1620V2. It's essentially an i7-3770K on steroids. It's the same 4 cores, 8 threads, but at a 3.7 and 3.9 GHz base and boost clock respectively. It also has full quad-channel DDR3 support for the X79 platform, as well as registered ECC support as it is still a Xeon. Oh, it also has a full 40 PCI Express 3.0 lanes, back when Intel actually included a decent number of those in their processors. Pairing with the CPU is a 16GB quad-channel kit of Kingston HyperX Genesis memory running at 1600 MHz, a Kingston A1000 240GB NVMe SSD. We've got this weird Alzai cooler, which is a dual-tower triple 90mm fan cooler. That was only $33 on Amazon, and I'm really curious to see how that one performs. And at the far end, we have a Corsair RM650i gold-rated power supply. The case for today's build is, well, under the table, as it wouldn't fit on the table with the rest of the parts, but you're probably looking at some B-roll of it now anyway. It is the DIY PC Vanguard RGB. It's an ATX mid-tower with a tempered glass side panel and RGB fans included. And just because I couldn't resist, we got a full custom sleeve set of green cabling to match the build. So let's go ahead and get this thing all together and find out, number one, what it looks like, but number two, how does it perform? So the build and the benchmarking is now complete, and the term beautiful mess keeps running through my head, and I think that may end up being the name of this particular build. Looks-wise, it is one of my favorite and least favorite builds I've ever done because of quite a few different aspects. We'll start off with the case itself and just kind of work our way through. Again, the DIY PC Vanguard RGB mid-tower ATX case. I love the tempered glass panels on this, especially the rear smoked glass panel. You do have to pay very close attention to cable management, as you can see all of your cable management in the rear of this case. But honestly, very, very simple case to build in, nice and rigid, very good construction. The case came together very, very well and pretty well featured. You've got your magnetic dust cover up on top, as well as another dust cover down on the power supply. The front I/O is pretty standard with two USB 2.0s, two USB 3.0s, front audio, your power and reset buttons, as well as your fan control, including lighting and speed. And I kid you not, your speed options are low, high, and off. So if you wanted to turn your fans off, you can do that. I don't know why you would want to do that, but it's an option. Again, looks-wise, this is one of the favorite PCs that I've ever put together, although I do wish I would have gone with a different CPU cooler. I'm not disappointed with the performance of that CPU cooler, but the looks are pretty atrocious. When I bought the AllsEye DR90, it advertised a couple of specs that really had me intrigued, especially for the $33 price point. First and foremost, it's a twin tower cooler with 6 heat pipes integrated into it, only 90mm in fan size, but I figured the extra heat pipes would make it perform much, much better than even like a Hyper 212 or something similar. However, it was advertised as being an RGB cooler, and they didn't technically lie because there are red, green, blue, and white LEDs on there. You just can't change what they look like. That's right, these are custom RGB strips with red, blue, green, and white LEDs just laid out on a strip. So any hopes of color matching my green and silver build were pretty thoroughly dashed. Even with the 6 heat pipes, I was a little bit nervous installing this cooler, especially because I didn't know what the performance of these fans was going to be. Luckily, that fear was not founded, as the highest observed temperature I saw on my 1620 V2 was only 48 degrees Celsius, and that was after multiple consecutive Cinebench runs. Had these fans not performed all that well, I did have a backup plan with some Noctua redo fans in 92mm size. I didn't end up having to use these, although I probably should have, because number one, they would have performed even better, and number two, they would have matched my build colors just a little bit better than these did. God, those things are terrible looking. As far as the rest of the looks in this case go, probably my favorite thing about this build has got to be those green cables. That extension kit was only about $30 on Amazon, and the quality of those cables and the included cable combs are absolutely fantastic. They took almost no training at all to get to set into place, and honestly really make this whole build pop. So links for all the parts will be down in the video description, but I highly recommend those cable extensions. On to the rest of the hardware itself. My Intel Xeon E5 1620 V2 again is an unlocked CPU, so I did have some aspirations of being able to overclock this. Was I successful? No, I wasn't. A couple of the knockoff X79 boards I've dealt with in the past do have the CPU multiplier unlocked inside of the BIOS. However, most of them have tapped out at 39, meaning you can only have a max of a 3.9 GHz overclock. I was hoping to at least achieve that, if not go to maybe 4.2 or 4.4 with the CPU. However, the CPU ratio isn't even an option anywhere inside of the BIOS. Now, I know there are some BIOS hacks out there for some knockoff X79 boards like this one, however, I was not able to find my exact model on some of the Russian sites, so I was not able to actually hack the BIOS and unlock that multiplier. Memory-wise, my 16GB kit of Kingston HyperX Genesis was able to hit 1600 MHz, however, 1866 was not achievable on this board. I was able to set it in the BIOS, but the system refused to post once set. Now, NVMe is not natively supported by the X79 chipset, however, I was able to install and boot off my NVMe drive on this system no problem at all. However, it's not running at NVMe Gen 3 speeds. Now, my A1000 Kingston drive is rated to about 1500 megabytes per second, and I have seen very close to that in real-world results on a couple of different test rigs. However, I was only able to see about 850 megabytes per second read and writes on this system, so we're running closer to Gen 2 speeds. And finally, on to the performance testing, where we do have some very interesting results both for the CPU and for games performance. Cinebench R15 gives us a multi-threaded score of 658 and a single-threaded score of 129. And for a 7-year-old 4-core 8-threaded CPU, that doesn't sound too terrible on the surface. Until you consider that it almost gets beat flat out by a Ryzen 3 2200G. While I was able to get this X79 motherboard and the 1650 V2 for only about $125, For $150, I could get a Ryzen 3 2200G and a B350 motherboard. Heck, for $210, I could make that a Ryzen 7 1700 system. Those systems have upgrade options, and both of those are much more powerful, single-threaded, and especially with the 1700, multi-threaded than this system will ever be. Instead of the $35 E5 1650 V2 CPU that I used, you could spend $100 and get an E5 2689 8-core 2.9 GHz CPU. But again, the Ryzen 7 1700 is still well going to outclass that CPU. As long as those Ryzen part prices continue to fall, these are going to continue to make less and less sense unless these prices also continue to fall. But being as the most of your expense right now is in the motherboard, I don't see that happening anytime soon. But that's enough talking about pricing and hypotheticals. Let's go ahead and get into the gaming results, as I'm sure that's why you're all here. 3D Mark Time Spy got an 11,597 GPU score when running a single RX 470, and jumped that 80% all the way to 20,863 when running in Crossfire. 3D Mark Time Spy was even more impressive, jumping 90% from a 3488 to a 6628 GPU score when both GPUs were enabled. But for multi-GPU systems, the question always is, can you take those synthetic results and turn them into real-world gains inside of gameplay? Well, for at least one game, the answer absolutely is yes. Sniper Elite 4 jumped up 80% in average frame rates from 89.0 to 160.6. The really interesting thing about this title is it brought the low frame rates up with it, seeing a 94.8 FPS on the 0.1% low, whereas before we were dropping all the way down to 29 with a single card. And I really wish I could say these results were replicated throughout, however, sadly, that is just not the case. Project Cars 2 saw the next biggest improvement at 30% on average, from an 82.3 FPS to 106.8, however the lows stayed pretty much the same. Rocket League also saw a 16% improvement on the average frame rates, however the lows dropped off by about 9%. Now I will say the experience was still not bad at 82 FPS, but I wasn't complaining about the 184 FPS on average I got with a single card either. I've tested GTA 5 in the past with an SLI configuration, and I was hoping for similar results inside of Crossfire. However, again, that just wasn't the case. We did see a 14% improvement in the average frame rates, up from 51 to 58. However, our lows dropped all the way from 33 down to almost 10 FPS, with some pretty significant stuttering to go along with it. And that's going to wrap it up for my gaming tests inside of Crossfire. Not because I didn't test 3 other games, Doom, Hitman 2, and Wreckfest, but because the second GPU sat idle when running those games. And it is conclusion time. Let's go ahead and start with my RX 470s in Crossfire. For $55, I think a single RX 470 at that price point makes a pretty stellar deal for a budget gamer. Pretty much every game that I tested with a single card did go above 60 FPS on average, the exception being GTA 5, but that was running at ultra settings just in case we did see gains inside of Crossfire. That could very easily be tweaked down to about 75 to 80 FPS on average with some lighter settings. While Crossfire netted us near perfect doubling inside of 3D Mark Time Spy, a synthetic test does not a game result make. The only game that showed us anywhere close to those results was Sniper Elite 4 with 80% improvements on the average frame rate. Project Cars 2 showed a 30% improvement, and the other 2 games could probably be achieved without the downsides with a pretty hefty overclock on these cards. So, like I said, $55 for a single RX 470, not a bad deal and still pretty competent when it comes to AAA titles, especially when it comes to esports gaming. However, don't put 2 of these in your system at the same time. If you do want to spend $110 on a used GPU, I would recommend going for an RX 580 8GB or a GTX 1060 6GB card, as you'll be much happier with your performance overall. Moving on, how about the Intel Xeon E5 1620 V2 CPU? Again, 4 cores, 8 threads, 3.7 GHz. I think it's a fine chip for $35, but there's nothing remarkable about it either. While it did perform pretty adequately in AAA titles, it's going to be limited by 4 cores and 8 threads here pretty darn soon, especially as the core counts continue to rise. Zen. Especially with that overclocking available on this motherboard, there's really not a lot extra that you can get out of this CPU. I think if I could overclock it to 4.4 or 4.6, I'd have a different opinion on it, but at 3.7 GHz, it's just a little bit lackluster for me. And finally, how about this X79 board at $90? This one stings a little bit to say. I think the platform of buying used Xeons for the X79 C602 chipset is going to die, and it's going to die rather quickly. As AMD continues to bring more and more competition to the modern market, I think boards like this and used Xeons like this are going to make less and less sense as we move along. I have been a longtime fan of these motherboards, of the X79 platform in general, and of using used Xeons in your workstation at home. I built my first one in 2007. I'm no stranger to this game. What it comes down to me is overall value on the platform, and honestly, with these X79 knockoff boards, I'm seeing less and less of it as the years go on. Back in 2017, when I did my very first knockoff X79 video, the platform made a lot of sense. Intel only had 4 cores and 8 threads on the consumer market available for about $350 in the i7-7700K. If you wanted 6 cores, you had to go to the X99 platform with the 6800K, and that cost you about $500. If you wanted 8 cores, it was $1,000. Zen had only been released about 2 months prior to that video, and honestly was very much untested and still pretty buggy in its early release. Picking up a used Xeon like an E5 2667 or 2670 was not unheard of in those days, and was actually pretty common in workstations if you wanted more cores and more threads than Intel would otherwise sell you. However, as the years have gone on and there is actual competition in the marketplace now, you can get 8 cores for as low as $160. Heck, you can get 6 cores for $120, brand new on a lot of retail sites. So where does this platform fit in anymore? Also in 2017, DDR4 memory prices were still climbing to their all-time high, which meant DDR3 was a pretty viable alternative if you wanted to sacrifice speed for high capacity and budget. Basically what I'm saying is don't be fooled by the allure of a multi-thread and high RAM capacity system in sake of performance. You're not going to get the return you think you are going to get on this. Back in 2017, this was a fantastic budget option for someone who needed high capacity memory and a lot of cores and a lot of threads, because honestly that just wasn't available on the consumer market. Now that prices have dropped down, you can get that in a modern platform for a much more modest price. So yes, you could pick up this motherboard, an Intel Xeon E5 2689 and 16GB of DDR3 for about $250 and then game and work to your heart's content. Or for that same $250, get a Ryzen 7 1700, a B350 motherboard, and 16GB of much faster DDR4, and be about 20% faster overall. If you already have some of the parts that you need to make this X79 system work, and I'm not talking the case or the power supply or the graphics cards, I'm saying you already have a used compatible Xeon laying around, or you have a bunch of DDR3 memory and you don't want to have to upgrade to DDR4, or let's say maybe you live in a region of the world where new parts are not available at an affordable price, then this platform may still make sense. However, if you're looking at jumping onto eBay or AliExpress and picking up a motherboard, a CPU, and a bunch of RAM, your money is going to be much better spent buying a newer platform. And before you leave me all your hate down in the comments that I don't like these knockoff boards anymore, oh, you've sold out. No, it's nothing like that. I'm just looking at performance data, and the performance data and prices don't lie. I really do still like these boards. I was one of the first to do an English video on these boards. In fact, I'm pretty sure I had a hand in raising the price of the 2667 Xeon by myself. So yeah, I love this platform, but it's probably time to move on. However, if you do have a viable use for one of these boards and this platform, let me know down in the comments. I might try to explore that use case further. As always, be sure to like this video if you liked it, thumbs down if you didn't like it, and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. Follow me on Twitter at Craft Computing to keep up with my daily shenanigans, and if you'd like to financially support the channel, make sure to back me on Patreon. If you want to buy any of the parts that I put in this build today, or any of the parts that I recommended buying instead of these parts, go ahead and check out the Amazon affiliate links down in the video description. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching this one, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.